Hello. So I'm going to be pouring some wax into some, essentially what's called used to be called a Victory Brown, sometimes still called Victory Brown, microcrystalline wax, kind of medium, soft kind of wax we use in foundry and bronze casting and aluminum casting and lost wax casting, into a plaster piece mold. And I can also pour it into rubber molds. I might actually pour a mold out to do that as well. But about melting wax, this is an electric hot pan. Kind of like deeper ones better, but this is what I got right now. First off, temperature-wise, you don't want, and also you want some ventilation. You want airflow, so I'm going to be breathing a lot of this in. But you also want to have an electric pot. Don't melt wax over an open flame. It can ignite. So keep the wax away. Don't melt it in a pot with an open flame underneath. If you have a stove like that, you can do it with a double boiler, but you don't want the heat directly on the pan. So it's an electric pan actually, and we've got it just above warm, in between kind of warm and what's on this one about 200. So 175 is a pretty good temperature. You don't want to crank it up. If you've got it, you want to melt it really fast. If you get the wax really hot, one, if you splash it on yourself, you're going to burn yourself worse. Two, you're creating more fumes. If it's smoke coming off of it, you've got it way too hot. You're burning away your wax, and you're breathing in more nasty stuff. And so keep it at a relatively low temperature, 175 or so, and so it should be melting, but you shouldn't see any kind of smoke coming off of it. What else? Lots of ways you can pour it into, when you pour it into plaster, you should soak the plaster in water so that the wax won't absorb into it. Rubber molds is usually pretty good. It'll work pretty well. You don't need a release agent like silicone or urethane molds. Even latex, a little trickier, but or you can also pour it into open face clay molds. You'll get a rough kind of, like when you're a kid, you pressed your hand into clay and you pour the plaster in. You can also pour wax in that. You have to clean the clay residue off of the wax. I'm just stirring it to get myself busy. I don't really need to stir it. You also want a couple other things. When you say you pour this wax out of here, unplug it. It's a good idea to unplug the wax, unplug it from the device, so that it's not hot. Because when you pour out all that wax and then you set it back down, it's still on, and that little bit of wax residue is going to heat up a lot quicker and create a lot of smoke. So if you don't have a lot of wax in there, it'll burn quicker. So you never want to completely, you don't want to leave it unattended, as they say. I'm mixing a bunch of scrap stuff in here. So, what else about wax, Joe? All right, hello again. So, we have a couple of different little molds, and then we're going to do a larger plaster piece mold. So this is the wax. Remember, you don't want it too hot. In fact, usually what I do is once I get it molten and I'm sure that all the chunks are gone, I unplug it just to let it start cooling down. You don't want it raging hot. And actually that's often what I'll do, and have it kind of cooler, is even a method of like letting it get a skin, then mixing that together, and that being a skin being cooling on the surface so that it has a thin skin, and then mixing it together. Anyway, but for thinner things, like I'm going to show you first, so while we're waiting for it, like I have this a mold here. It's a rubber mold with a rubber inner mold with a plaster mother mold, and I'm just going to use a cup to pour it into that, and tap on it a little bit to help keep the bubbles from coming out. Now if I use a cup, here's a paper cup. You can also get a metal ladle and stuff, but here's a little paper cup, and here's a plasticky cup. This one, the one that's plasticky, will melt if I stick it in there. That's how hot it is. So I'm going to use this little paper cup. Careful not to burn yourself. Some people will utilize a pair of heavy rubber gloves. You can use thin ones, but realize they're not going to protect you against too much heat. So I'm going to take some of this in here, get a little bit of volume, make a little pouring spout, and pour it into the mold slowly. And I get it filled up, and I might tap on a little bit. I don't want to make it so I and mess up any kind of registration. Careful not to splash the wax on yourself. All right, so I'm gonna set that out of the way. Let it cool. Sometimes it melts back in. Another method is to use a syringe. Now there's also pressurized wax pots. I have one of those around here. Don't use it a whole lot. For little molds, you have to be specifically made for those types of things to inject the wax in there. This is sort of a, you know, cheap version of that idea. Now, I put a little bit of petroleum jelly on here to help keep it sliding. What you don't want to do, because the wax will cool, if you suck it up in here and then feed it out, you fill it and you leave some in there and let that cool, that's ruined pretty much. So even if you get it filled, you want to squirt out the rest of the wax. So I'm going to do is bring it up like that. Oh, there's a little mold in here. I'm using this cup to hold it up. Pull this up so I get some wax. Put that in there. And spray it all over myself. Be careful not to spray it all over yourself. Do this, and I'm going to make sure a couple of times that the air is flowing through, so I don't let it cool over. You know, seal up the end with the wax. All right, that should be good. I also don't leave it all the way down like that. Pull it up here, so it doesn't end up getting stuck. There's a little bit of wax residue in there, and it'll end up stuck in there. All right, so that's for a small mold. And then another way to do it, you could, sometimes I'll pour a little bit of wax in and rock it around, but you can also use like a brush. And once you use a brush for the wax, it's pretty much ruined. This is kind of big for this, but say I wanted a thinner shell, start out with it warm, and I'll dab that in there, trying to get it in all the nooks and crannies. Now there's a situation where if you let it cool too much, your layers of wax will be delaminated. So if I put in a layer of wax and then let it cool and try to brush in another layer, you know, if I keep brushing this on when it's still hot, I'm just wearing it off of the high ridges. All right, to clarify what I just said there, if you let it cool too much between layers, it won't bond together, and it'll delaminate when you move it around. And if you have it too hot the whole time, it will kind of keep melting the layers of wax, so you keep getting thin things in the high points, or the ridges of the mold. You want to, if you unplug it, it'll slowly cool, and if you time it right, as you brush it in, especially with a larger mold, as you brush it in, it'll start out hot and then start to cool, and you'll get it, if you move quickly enough, you can kind of build it up thick as the wax cools, and it'll still bond together. It's all about timing. Alright, so let's see how these, take this open-faced rubber mold. So that came out reasonably well. Well, this one did. Flex it back and forth a little bit. Huh. Not too bad, some flashing on the edges. But all in all, there's a little vent that was cut so it would fill. Not too bad. Anyway, so this is the rubber mold with the mother mold around it, the plaster mother mold. So we can kind of take this apart, the mother mold off, and have the rubber mold inside, and we can kind of pull this back. This part is kind of hard to get off. Not too bad. It's kind of an old mold, old piece.